So who's heard of programmatic advertising? All right. More than a few hands with the crypto stuff. I've been part of Web3 for all of a year, so it's still in its infancy. So by no means is it super robust. The user experience is clunky at best, but suffice to say it's early and there's going to be a lot of innovation and opportunity. So is it an evolution or a revolution? Spoiler alert. All right, I'm saying evolution because there's enough animosity and us versus them out there. So I look at Web3 as more of additive versus trying to compete with the existing stakeholders. So going back to Web 1, dial-up, which again, probably not too many of you are familiar with how that used to work. But suffice to say, Web 1 was very static, HTML, read-only, not a lot of interaction. Web 2, which is what we've pretty much grown up with today, read and write, platform economy. You've got Meta, formerly known as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, some other platforms that me being Gen X do not engage with, but these are largely consumer-facing platforms that are free. We'll use some air quotes there. And it's read and write, so you can comment, post, engage essentially in new ways that you could not in Web 1. What we do in Web 3, which again is a work in progress, is read, write, and own. What do I mean by own? We're talking about your data, my data, our data. So if you're thinking about what's happened with Web 2, it's largely been ruled by these big platforms. We talked about Meta's earnings announcement yesterday, Google and Twitter. These are multi-billion-dollar companies that their primary product is advertising, and we are the fuel for their advertising. So you can think of us as ultimately being the product, and it goes back to the old adage, if something's free, you're probably the product. So with blockchain, this is going to essentially revolutionize how data is collected, permissioned, and exchanged. So there's going to be a new value exchange in this Web3 data economy, or internet, if you want to refer to it as that. And I won't get into all of the attributes of blockchain too much, but decentralization, that's already come up, and transparency is huge. That's really lacking today. And if you're curious about how your data is consumed, analyzed, and monetized by not just those big platforms I mentioned, but by data brokers, I would recommend John Oliver. He's the host of Last Week Tonight, and he did a deep dive on data brokers, which is equally entertaining and scary. So it's close to Halloween. That might be fun to check out. Now, with Web3, as we discussed earlier, we're talking about cryptocurrencies, NFTs, and some people are starting to refer to these as digital assets to make it a little bit more digestible for the average consumer. Instead of talking about non-fungible tokens, you're talking about digital artwork or digital collectibles, which I think a lot of us can probably relate to a little bit easier. Maybe it's just me. But in addition to having these assets, being able to store them in one place in a digital wallet makes a lot of sense. So whether it's your Bitcoin, your Ethereum, fill in the blank on whatever token you're talking about, as well as your NFTs and your data, ultimately that's where the puck is headed here. And brands are going to be able to utilize NFTs in particular as a way to engage and understand consumer behavior, but in a more privacy-friendly way and more of a consent-based manner. So Web3 wallets have set this new industry standard, and of course, we're going to be able to monetize our content and manage our identities in new ways. And it's really going to be this next gen of the internet, again, where we're participating, but we're also taking ownership, versus today where we're largely just the product of all those big platforms. And to give you an idea of what your data is worth, for example, Twitter, average revenue per user, that's one way they kind of measure monetization, is about $13, give or take. So that's what they make in 1 quarter based on one user. Facebook, Meta, Similar, it's roughly $10 per user per quarter. And if you think about them having 2.8 billion users globally, that adds up to a few enchiladas. Now, some people might say Web3, Elon Musk came up finally. So Elon Musk said, where's Web3? I can't find it. Haha, all right. So Web3 is a work in progress, and it's two components. It's technology and it's a movement. So the technology part, of course, is underpinned by blockchain, but as far as the movement, it's really about inclusivity, it's about transparency, and data ownership, as I mentioned. So those are kind of the three components. And this is from December 2000. The internet may be just a passing fad as people give up on it. So again, that's kind of hindsight, just to give you an idea of what people thought about the internet back in the day. I had another quote from Paul Krugman, who is an economics guru. He said, quote unquote, "The internet is nothing more than a glorified fax machine." And if you know what a fax machine is, hat tip there, because that's kind of an antiquated piece of technology. But people kind of poo-pooed the internet, just like they're doing the same with Web3, because they A, don't understand it, or B, it's potentially risky, or C, all of the above. So if it threatens the current stakeholders like Google, for example, they may or may not say, all right, we're gonna get on board here. But Google already sees Web3 as a revenue opportunity, so they do have teams that are actively selling their cloud services to Web3 projects because they think there's something there. There's utility, there's value. So we talked about crypto winter. This is a really cool chart, and I'll just kind of get you oriented here. There's the upper x-axis from 1990 to 2000. That is the internet adoption. The lower x-axis is crypto adoption. And then total users on the right, on the y-axis. And you can see they are eerily mapping each other. So if you think back to the last slide, in 2000, there was this dot-com bubble, economic recession, et cetera, but adoption continued. The infrastructure was there was utility, it added value to people's lives, it added value to businesses, so adoption continued. And I think we're gonna see similar with crypto. And there's a lot of infrastructure already built, there's adoption happening, and going back to Alex and Mike's commentaries there, regulation is kind of a work in progress, so to be determined on whether it's the SEC or the CFTC that ultimately kind of puts guardrails on to make it safer for financial investors and consumers alike to adopt. So right now you have a lot of folks kind of on the fence, and I'm gonna be following this closely as an analyst, because ultimately you want it to be safer than it currently is, because there's a lot of fraud, a lot of scammers. I've fallen prey to it. I'm sure pretty much anybody that's been in crypto early on can tell you a similar story that, hey, there's some bad people out there taking advantage right now, but that will change as regulation comes on board. So I mentioned Web3 being about this data ownership and sharing your data and ultimately getting a cut of the upside in the platform. So imagine if Google, Facebook, Meta, and Instagram and all these other platforms, imagine if they gave you some sort of a micropayment each month or each quarter for sharing your data instead of them harvesting it and collecting it and selling it, right? So it's part of the terms and conditions of these platforms, but there are Web3 projects out there right now that are allowing you to anonymously contribute your data, your browsing behavior, and it's being pooled together with millions of other people's data and then monetized, and ultimately you get micropayments or some kind of crypto rewards or even NFTs in exchange for that. So 79% of consumers are willing to share personal data if there's some sort of a digital carrot at the end of the stick for them. And that makes sense. And again, that goes back to transparency and trust. If you do this, you will receive this. Right now, that does not really exist, and that's why we're seeing a lot of government legislation around consumer data privacy, whether it's in the European Union with GDPR or in the United States with CCPA and some other state regulations. Quote here from McKinsey, and again, McKinsey is one of these huge, probably one of the best known consultancies globally. If nothing else, they have the highest billing rates out of all the consultants, so I think that says something. And again, they're talking about transparency, visibility, and the seamless embedded user experience. The last part is still a work in progress. So the UX is still largely clunky, and then what fun is a presentation without some logo eye candy? So as an analyst, I like to understand who does what in a given ecosystem, and having worked in advertising, I thought it would be fun. I did this about a year ago now, but looking at projects that were in the attention economy versus activity and orchestration. So basically ad tech, right, paid media on the left, the middle column, you're talking about browsers that analyze consumer behavior anonymously, and these are referred to as data unions in some cases. And then last but not least, we have infrastructure for this orchestration of data, whether it's storing it or being able to share it, monetize it, and so on. But this is just a sampling. There are thousands of projects out there, and suffice to say, with the crypto winter, some of these logos might not be here in the next 6 to 12 months, and by no means am I saying these are worth investing in. Do your own research, and by all means, you know, it's very early. So what I like about Web3 is it's not necessarily pay to play. You can participate, you can, you know, in some cases, use a browser plugin, start sharing your data, or use one of these privacy browsers and earn crypto as you surf, and it doesn't require a purchase. So you don't have to fork over $20,000 for Bitcoin. You can start participating in Web3 just by sharing your data, but only if you want to, which is vastly different than what goes on in Web 2 today. And with that said, I'm happy to connect on crypto Twitter, as it's called, LinkedIn. If you have a question that you can't think of right now that comes up later, feel free to email me. And thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
So you mentioned about basically sharing your personal data and receiving a reward. I guess I'm curious to know what kind of personal data does that involve, and you know, with other emerging technologies, say like AI, right? What's to stop businesses or brands from using that same technology as kind of like in the background, so you can, you know, share your personal data, but they'll keep digging more beyond what's allowed per se.
Right. Short answer is there's nothing to prevent people from doing that. So technology is a tool ultimately. It can be used for good or bad, of course. And again, I mentioned that John Oliver, I'll call it a skit, but I would recommend, if you're curious to know what can happen currently, take a watch of that, and that will open your eyes, if nothing else, you know, give you a few laughs at the same time at what's possible. But with a lot of these technologies that I had up here, or projects, I should say, they are very much about privacy and following GDPR, which is in the European Union, which Mike had mentioned. They have very strict guidelines compared to what we have here in the United States. So when you take GDPR and that's kind of your base, and then you start doing additional security measures around that, which is what a lot of these projects are doing, it's a lot safer than what's currently going on. And there are hacks. You know, your Home Depot account, Target, these are huge Fortune 500 companies that have been hacked, and people's social security numbers and credit card numbers and everything else have been stolen. So yeah, it's a great question, but yeah, there's nothing to, there's no definitive, it's not going to happen because of this. But because of blockchain's, I guess, capabilities, it's safer than a lot of what we have in Web 2.0.
Awesome. So Seth, I know you were talking earlier about my business and the, you know, data privacy side of things. But one thing we've had a lot of talks about internally is, do people really care about their data? I know it's been a huge topic of conversation. Like, people talk about how, oh, I don't want to share my data, but will they put their wallets behind that? What do you feel about the current consumer sentiment? And do you really think there's an incentive for people to leave things like Facebook, where they already have this massive buy-in to like memories and connections, to things that maybe reward them in those kinds of manners that you mentioned?
Yeah, so I think early adopters are people who are data scientists and I don't want to say IT geeks, but yeah, hey, if the shoe fits, fine. Yeah, it's early days, so people that are jumping on board and thinking they're going to get crypto rich by joining, say, a data union and sharing or pooling their data with other folks, that's one mindset that is kind of flawed. But think about if you've been using Google search, for example, for the last 20 years. Imagine if each search you conducted, you got a sliver of a micropayment in some cryptocurrency. Over the course of 5, 10 years, et cetera, that becomes something substantial. So in a very, I guess, high level, at a high level, you could think of what's going on in Web3, setting the stage for a universal basic income based on your data. And that, let's say it's a couple dollars a month for all of us here. That's not a lot for us, but if you are in, Africa or some third world country, that's real money, and that's making a difference. I mean, I wouldn't mind a free cup of coffee once a quarter, Meta doesn't give me that today, but some of these projects will.
Both you and Mike use the word quarterlies, as in quarterly corporate earnings. That's the way that publicly traded companies report how they're doing. It's part of the consumer protection that we have. What is your advice for students who might work for a startup company in terms of passing the Thanksgiving test, which is what I call being able to tell your great uncle and your grandma that your internship or your job is with a real company? So what do you say to students who might go into an innovation space in terms of not just justifying it to their family, but justifying to themselves that what they're working on is real, especially if that's a private company as opposed to a large big tech company?
Yeah. I think you used the term underdog early on. So very early in my career, I turned down an opportunity with Google before it was public. And ever since then, I have, kind of carried the flag for the startups and the third party or third tier ad tech vendors that were kind of competing with them in some ways, or trying to differentiate and innovate and do things a little differently. That's why Web3 is so compelling to me. But to answer your question, you've got to come up with your own storyline. And I love the idea of building something versus working for the McDonald's of digital advertising, which is what I refer to Meta as. So that's my take, chip on the shoulder, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, there's different ways to look at it. I love the growth mindset and wearing different hats versus here's a Fortune 100 company, you're plugged in here, here's your world and how you get to operate, versus where I've partnered with some Web3 companies and I've done business development, I've done sales, I've done marketing, I've done community management. So whatever you're interested in, if you're fluent on social media, you like doing that, there are tremendous opportunities there. As Alex was mentioning, crypto Twitter is a real thing. It's a huge arena. There's also ad tech Twitter. I have a whole bunch of friends that'll host spaces periodically, and we nerd out on ad tech and programmatic advertising and analytics. So, to his point, definitely get engaged there. If you're interested in learning, if you find a project or a company that's interesting, it's a great way to reach out to somebody and connect with them one-on-one and ask questions and that sort of thing. Or at a minimum, you start following some of the projects and thought leaders that you think are interesting. And from there, you can kind of chart your own path. Awesome. Thank you very much.